Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar today. I am Maria Fantapie, and I'm the head of the Mediterranean, Middle East and Africa program at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. I'm extremely honored and pleased to have today virtually joining here in Rome two of the most knowledgeable experts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have today joining us from Tel Aviv, Dalia Schindlin, who is a political strategy and election expert and a fellow at the Century Foundation, and also the author of The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, who was just recently published in September, and who is also the author of a number of op-eds that you can read online. And Professor Yazid Sayegh, who's an academic, author of The Armed Struggle and the Search for the State, the Palestinian National Movement from 1949 to 1993. Yazid has been also personally engaged into the negotiation of the Gaza-Jericho Agreement in 1994, and he's currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Malcolm Care Center in Beirut. So thank you both for joining us today at this critical time, and we're going to try in the next hour really to unpack what has been the weight of this historical landmark of October 7th event and how this has impacted really Israel and Palestinian domestic politics and what should or could be the EU response to it. Let me start with you, Dalia, and I would like to actually quote one of your recent pieces on The Guardian, where you say that Hamas may have actually, with the attack, pushed the Israelis into a far darker place than Netanyahu has ever dreamt of. And you also say that Netanyahu political trajectory and legacy may be over, but still, this maybe doesn't even matter because Israeli domestic opinion is shifting on a certain right-wing side. So can you tell us a little bit really from Tel Aviv also, what this unity government that has been formed last week looks like? What type of parties have been brought in? And is it really, I mean, a moment of unity for Israel, or the cracks within the Israeli society that you have long worked on are still actually under the surface boiling? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for participating. Yes, I mean, for one thing, I should say that anything I can say about public opinion, especially in terms of political or electoral trends, is very preliminary. You know, I was writing this analysis based on what I have seen over previous rounds of violence. At the best of times, public opinion researchers like me should not be predicting the future, but at a time like this, we have to qualify it that we haven't seen anything like this before, and we do have previous experience to go on as only an indicator. And what we've always seen in Israeli politics, at least in the last, I would say, 3 decades, you know, you can argue things were maybe different in the past, but over the last 3 decades, since the 1990s, whenever we see major escalations of attacks against Israelis, particularly when they are terror attacks, by which I mean attacks targeting civilians, we see Israeli opinion moving to the right wing. Now, the point that I was trying to make is that Netanyahu himself is doing, at this point, very badly in terms of public sentiment, and it did not start with the attacks on October 7th. It began very quickly after the last government was formed. The government that he created was fundamentally frightening for many Israelis. Remember that the parties of the current coalition barely won half of the votes. They have a significant parliamentary majority because of the way those votes are counted and break down, but the country was very, very deeply divided in half over this government. His personal ratings, his government's ratings, his coalition, and each particular party had been declining severely in the polls consistently from January onward, when they released the package of reforms to the judiciary that were intended to scrap judicial independence. So that was the starting point. And they had, sometimes there had been like a little bit of recovery, but they had never in any poll, except for his own personal pollsters, they had never shown, there had not been any polling showing them winning a majority of seats before October 7th. What we're seeing now is that their electoral predictions and polls, the few polls that have been taken since this attack and the war began, show them at a tremendous low point at the electoral level and at the personal level. Netanyahu, his personal ratings, his suitability to be prime minister, all of those have plunged. His coalition is not even getting 55 out of 120 seats in surveys, which is what it was before October 7th. It's gone, in the most recent poll, it went down to 42 seats out of 120. They currently have 64, just to remind everybody. But I'm trying to make the separation between how Israelis view Netanyahu and this current government, which people are absolutely furious at the government, including from people who voted for the government. There is a big distinction between that and what I consider to be a very likely drift to the ideological right wing. Remember that to be right wing in Israeli society is not about conservative values or small government or lower taxes. It is about being hardline, militant on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, resorting to military solutions for everything, opposing and rejecting all concessions, and committing to Israel's total control over all of the land and people in some form between the river and the sea. And I expect Israelis will be moving in that direction, even if this ultimately, proves to drive down support for both Netanyahu as a leader, his party, and his government. I should also say that if he ends up in some way, shape, or form after this war is over, leaving office, however that happens, there is every reason to think more people will vote for Likud, because everybody's angry at him, but they're not necessarily as angry at the party, which is still seen somehow as more moderate than the further far-right nationalist, theocratic, and authoritarian political parties in the government with him. In terms of what the unity coalition looks like right now, it's really just the Netanyahu government plus one extra party. We hear there's plenty of possibilities for other parties to join, but so far it's only the party that is currently polling in first place. This is not the party that won first place in the opposition, for the opposition party. So it's not the head of the opposition, but it is gaining the most strength over the course of this year. That's National Unity Party, headed by former chief of staff and also erstwhile political coalition partner with Netanyahu, somebody who was burned by Netanyahu in 2020. His name is Benny Gantz. He has joined on the condition of being part of a narrow war cabinet, which does not include those very extremist ministers from the far right, ultra-nationalist parties of religious Zionism and Jewish power. So that's the nature of this coalition. It is expected to last as long as this war goes on. And after that, there's lots of speculation among Israelis that this government could either last its full term or completely collapse. And I just think it's too soon to say. Also depends on what they try to do domestically after the war is over. But right now, it's very hard to see when this war will be over, because all security assessments assume that this war will go on for quite a long time. And by that, I mean a matter of months. Again, it's hard to say for sure, but I would say we're looking at a minimum of probably a couple of months.
Thank you, Dalia. Yeah, a couple of months, or maybe also the prospect of a long war. And let me turn to you, Yazid, and really you have written extensively on the role of the army struggle in the Palestinian movement. At some point also in your writings, you also said that PLO, for instance, it had actually somewhat failed into the armed struggle. Can we say after this October 7th attack that instead Hamas at this point is the most effective security actor against Israel, and how this is shaping and reshaping the Palestinian landscape?
Thanks, Maria. I should warn you that the internet connectivity seems a little bit erratic here, so just in case you don't hear me all the time, let me know. I mean, Hamas has routinely proved itself more hardworking, more disciplined, better organized than its mainstream nationalist rival Fatah, which rules the West Bank. And that goes back a long time. But I think, answering your question, I can't do it on a sort of narrow level. I mean, right now, what Hamas did on 7 October was to demonstrate its superior discipline, its security, that is the protection of its planning and so on. But beyond that, sort of technical victory, so to speak, I think that any armed action has to be seen in a broader context, both its own social context among Palestinians, but also the broader historic one. And that's really what I tried to do in my big book on the Palestinian armed struggle, was to sort of distinguish between why Palestinians resorted to armed violence, to organized violence, to the armed struggle, what it meant in terms of the formation of national identity and national institutions, of gaining recognition on the world stage. But of course, there are many different forms of armed struggle. And what I fear has happened, this has been my personal perspective as a negotiator in the 1990s, someone who went to the occupied territories during that period and was involved in basically leading policy planning for the final status negotiations that started in 1999-2000. So as someone who's studied the Palestinian struggle from many different aspects, I fear that there's been a sort of valorization of armed struggle in and of itself, that guns and bearing guns is somehow, it has sanctity, which I think is deeply problematic on an ethical as well as a political level. And I think that what we saw in the Second Intifada, I was deeply opposed to it from the very start, precisely because it was an unleashing of emotions, of resentment, of frustration, which might have been understandable at the personal level of the individuals taking out their guns and firing at long ranges, in a very futile way at Israeli targets. But I think it was an abdication of their leadership that should have provided direction, both ethical and political. And I think, I at the time blamed the Palestinian leadership for not providing that compass and that leadership. Now, fast forward to today, Hamas has drawn on a very deep well of frustration and resentment among Palestinians that is entirely justified, because not only has Israel maintained its colonization literally daily under every single Israeli government since the peace process began, that includes governments of the right and the left, but also the so-called international community, by which we usually mean the United States and the European Union and a few others, have stood aside and allowed all this to happen without, pushing back in an effective manner, telling Israel, we support you, we support your security, but we will make, there will be consequences for colonizing and for altering reality on the ground, for driving out entire communities from their homes in the West Bank, as we now see, for condoning settler violence and indeed arming settler militias. All this has been without consequence. So I understand where Palestinian frustration and resentment come from, absolutely. But for an organization such as Hamas to wield that and meld it into a weapon which is then used to slaughter unarmed civilians, that I think is something sadly on a far greater scale in consequence. In other words, what Hamas is guilty of, I think first and foremost after the ethical responsibility for slaughtering civilians, is that as a leadership, it should understand the time, the moment in world history we're in, one in which many societies, maybe all societies around the world, are drifting rightward at an accelerating pace. Fascism is on the rise. What we've seen in Israel is part and parcel of what we've seen elsewhere in the world, in Poland or Germany or the United Kingdom or France or in India and elsewhere. So for Hamas to deploy this kind of violence at this time, I think is foolish in the extreme. That's to put it purely politically. And I think I've been clear on the ethical issue. So again, that's my assessment. This is how I approach what Hamas did in the course of a long trajectory of Palestinian political as well as armed struggle, of ethical struggle. And I think Hamas has done enormous damage to all that legacy.
Thank you, Yazid. And I think you pointed out really at this, what has been called this violent equilibrium between Hamas and Israel. And so there is this vicious cycle where that also Dalia has wrote about in her pieces, where every turn of violence that comes from Gaza, then the more Israel goes far right. And it seems that this is like also not only making Israel more authoritarian, but also making Gaza more authoritarian at the same time. And you have worked a lot on this as well. Dalia, over to you. I mean, how to like think about the next step of Israel in terms of like you have said that the attacks of the October 7th have also had a role in changing the collective imaginary of Israelis vis-a-vis of certain important institutions like the Israeli Defense Forces. And so, I mean, where does it go, Israel as a project right now? I mean, how, if you can like chart some of the line, and maybe if I can be more concrete, even on shifting to a new security paradigm, maybe, I mean, is Israel going to maybe going to go forward, like, and to maybe go beyond just attacking the Gaza Strip and go really after every single enemy that it has on its way across the region? I mean, how is it rethinking its security as well?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the impact of this on Israeli society, like I said, is still essentially under formation, but there's no question that the overriding thing that unites Israelis right now, at least Jewish Israelis, okay, I should specify, not all Israelis, Palestinian citizens, I don't think support this approach, but there's a very overwhelming sense that Israel needs to have a very, very tough military response. There's almost no opposition to that idea, except for a very small and confused, not confused, but anguished group of, anti-occupation, left-wing people who generally do not support military approaches, but it's very hard for them to find their voice right now. It doesn't help what we're seeing abroad, which is left-wing communities that are somehow divided over what to, how to acknowledge what happened on October 7th. It's really demoralizing to everybody here. But let's just be realistic. The vast majority of Israeli society is very united over some sort of very punishing military response. And I'm saying it like that purposely because the fact is, we don't have any real indication, not from political leaders and not from security people that I've been speaking to, that there's any particular aim for what happens in Gaza the day after. There is some, the day after this, catastrophic attack on Gaza and the assault that just today I was writing an article and I described it as apocalyptic. My editors said, no, apocalyptic means everybody's dead. Well, I gave in, but it looks pretty apocalyptic. We have 500,000 people who've been dislocated, hundreds and hundreds of children who've been killed, apparently over 60% civilians, of over 2,000 who've died. So I don't need to go through the data again, but there's going to be the devastation in Gaza. It will take probably decades to rebuild. As you probably all know in our audience, Gaza has barely managed to rebuild after each kind of round of fighting with Israel. And the fact that Israelis have low casualties and low levels of destruction, does not justify ever firing rockets into civilian areas, but it also is not the same on the Gazan side because the destruction is vast in every one of those wars, and Gaza barely has the chance to reconstruct itself. So this will set them back decades. It will also set Hamas back decades. I mean, the morality of it aside, I feel that everybody should be, unified in understanding why this is morally deplorable. But the strategic level, if we're, being cold analysts here, is I don't understand how this helps Hamas. I do expect that we'll see some boost of support for Hamas in Palestinian public opinion, only because that's what I've heard Palestinian experts tell me, and I sort of know how that dynamic works during these various confrontations. But the fact is, much of their infrastructure will be destroyed. Many of their top leadership will be dead, and not only the top leadership. So it's not clear who will be governing Gaza afterwards. And I think the first thing we need to put on the table is what happens to Gaza the next day. This is something that no Israeli official is answering. The entire stated goal is, there are a number of stated goals, actually. The government published some of these aims last night. They are all tactical and short-term. And the day after for Gaza is, in a way, more meaningful than anything else. I have ideas and I would love to consult with this audience, but I'd rather wait until we finish. In terms of other fronts, or at least get past this first round of questions, in terms of other fronts, it's interesting that your question is, will Israel now try to attack other targets? I have heard that view expressed, sort of in random conversations, not by anybody I would consider, an official who is hinting at it. That maybe Israel will use this as an opportunity to strike Iran even. I don't know if I believe that, because again, that was sort of speculative conversations, not from anybody with any proximity to the official levels. And mostly what Israelis are worried about is Hezbollah joining. Okay, there is also a very significant opinion coming from the security establishment, or some people in the security establishment, that Hezbollah was largely behind this. or deeply involved in planning this. Of course, we know about the heavy, let's say, fairly educated rumors that Iran was involved. So all of those things are in the mix. Now we have to also ask ourselves. So first we have where I think the most immediate threat is the northern border. Everybody is very concerned that Hezbollah. There has been, of course, exchange of fire. Hezbollah right now looks like it's being restrained so far about getting involved, but it would not take very much at all for this to escalate there. Israel has said it will hold the Lebanese government responsible for anything that happens there, and that is a likely front. In terms of, I think we have to keep our eye not only on countries where Israel might go to war, but countries where Israel theoretically has peace, which is no longer to be taken for granted. This is certainly going to put a strain on relations with Egypt and Jordan. Egypt is very integrally involved, as far as we know, in trying to negotiate, involved in a channel that, well, of course, they have to deal with the issue of the Rafah border with Gaza, and we're getting a lot of mixed messages as far as we know. There's the Qatari channel dealing with the hostages and maybe through Egyptian figures, but it's all very murky, and I wouldn't be able to say, for sure. But Egypt is in this, delicate position. Of course, Egypt doesn't want to take any refugees. I mean, none is too many, to be honest, if anybody remembers that phase of our history. So Egypt does not want any people from Gaza. And I don't even know what to say about that, because I know many people in Gaza, on the one hand, are fleeing for their lives and have nowhere to go and desperately want to cross in. And then on the other hand, in the Palestinian national sort of collective memory, the idea of leaving temporarily and then hoping you can come back doesn't work out very well. And so I know there's, this is causing major kind of rifts of identity within Palestinian society as well. So we have to worry about the situation with Egypt. Jordan is always put in a difficult position in these situations. And then, we don't know, this is the first, well, it's not the first, but it is the biggest test of relations with Israel's newest Arab allies through the Abraham Accords. Right now, the Saudis are saying, well, we're, they're basically pausing all of this talk about a deal. But I actually, this is really not very informed, but I'd have to guess that Saudi stands to play an important role and is not willing to completely sever its building, emerging relations with Israel, because I think it would like to have possibly, or be seen as having a key role in helping to stabilize the situation. If I were MBS, that's what I would want to do. And so I think what we're seeing is that they're making statements of solidarity with the Palestinians, but I still hear them as a little bit, requisite, de rigueur kinds of statements. And I imagine that they are trying to signal that they are they're expressing Palestinian solidarity with the fate of Gaza, but also maybe trying to preserve the credibility to be engaged in helping to de-escalate this in the future. Then we have the issue of the Americans, which is, I don't know if you want to get into that now or save that for a different question.
No, we can maybe return to that later, but okay, I wanted to get also Yazid reactions to the a very important line that you said, that I don't see how the attack has helped Hamas at all. And it goes in line also with what Yazid was saying before. But what I'm seeing here in Europe is that somehow the attack has also created a sort of idea whereby Hamas now has the legitimacy of the anti-colonial movement that once the PLO had back in the days. And so definitely, that's a question to ask. Maybe it's not helping Hamas, is not helping the Palestinians, is not helping people living in Gaza, but maybe it's really placing once again the Palestinian issue at the center of the global debate to a certain extent. I don't know, some reactions maybe from you, Yazid.
Yeah, a lot there. So I'll start with where you did with progressives, people on the left, others pro-Palestinian supporters abroad. Also the Palestinian diaspora, especially the younger generations, who want to do something for Palestine, feel that the Palestinians have been unjustly treated for decades, have been let down by Western governments and by their own leadership, and of course are oppressed in many different ways by Israel. And of course so there's Hamas has captured that moment and brought it to a head in a way and has done something that I think for many people, at least in the first hours, it looked like this astonishing thing that, you know, Hamas had pulled off. However, I think there are also problems there. One is that I think, and I'm addressing myself very specifically to younger people in your audience. I tell, you know, my children or young people I know and care for, that they shouldn't feel somehow defensive, in that they should feel totally free to say that they're horrified at the slaughter of Israeli civilians, and at the same time speak out against the massacre of Palestinians as well, to speak out against the Israeli occupation, against Western complicity. The two are not mutually exclusive. They need to go hand in hand. And I want, you know, young people and activists and Palestinian supporters of all ages to be able to speak out, because otherwise, I mean, why should we expect or accept that one particular political party, in this case Hamas, should receive our uncritical and unconditional political endorsement across the board? They're a political organization. I doubt there's any other political organization in any other society where we, you know, don't agree with something and disagree with something. We are entitled to disagree with Hamas, and they have to be held accountable for their actions. And, you know, so Palestinians and their supporters may be glad that the issue is back on, you know, back on the front page, as it were, that something has happened that questions, that challenges. However, they also have to use their critical faculty and ask, yes, but, you know, has this been done the right way? Do we even know what Hamas really wanted? I mean, if it wanted prisoner exchange, did it not understand that slaughtering civilians would undermine the entire enterprise, that it would bring terrible damage to the Palestinian cause and make it immensely difficult for people working in Western societies to continue to support the cause and utilize, you know, the evidence of what Israel does in the occupied territories every day to try and work for freedom, for liberation, for independence. So I think Palestinians and their supporters should feel empowered to challenge both sides in a way, you know, not to oppose Palestinians, but to challenge Hamas and hold it responsible. It has to, you know, it claims leadership, it claims moral leadership and political leadership. Then it has to show that leadership. And it has to have thought about what was going to happen to the people of Gaza. We're talking about a tiny space, to remind your audience, which is, I don't know what, the size of Rome maybe or something. I mean, it's a tiny space with 2.25 million people crammed in, destitute. 80% have been refugees since 1948, have been dependent on charity handouts forever. You know, think of all that. And then Israel has been given the means to pound them with the open and overt blessing of most major, you know, Western leaders. That had to have been part of the planning. And if Hamas, you know, it's not enough to say, the cause is great and, you know, liberation is on hand. Dalia referred to those on the Israeli side, the ultra-nationalists who speak of the river to the sea. And, you know, I see that kind of rhetoric now coming out from Palestinians who, you know, sort of gloss over what this means for parents and children in Gaza and elsewhere who weren't asked to make the ultimate sacrifice, but are making it, you know, de rigueur. And we gloss over all that by talking, or some of these people gloss over it by putting up slogans of river to the sea, total liberation is at hand. We're in a moment where people think like this or stop thinking. And I think that at least people who are far from the battlefield, especially, you know, people like my kids, have the luxury of being able to pause and think and use critical faculty. And that is basically how we fight fascism wherever it is and in whatever form it takes. And I think people in Italy face this. We know daily with immigration or racism. We face a rising tide in England or France. And this is when, you know, educated people, the so-called liberals, the centrists, should be exercising critical faculty. So I'm sorry I'm being quite academic in putting this, but I've been struggling for, you know, the last 9 or 10 days with massive emotions, devastated feelings, and I'm trying to. I don't see a small answer to any of these questions. This is all part of a much bigger moment.
Yeah, and we are here really to actually go beyond what happened next, and really to unpack those more critical questions, as you both have done. And I want to take exactly your last point and go back to Dalia and ask her about like those corners of the Israeli left that was really militant against the authoritarian growth in under Netanyahu government, and also the Jewish diaspora who is not agreeing with like such a harsh response that could, and retaliation who could come from this government. What would be like the plan for this? What could be a implementable political agenda for those at this point? Very difficult question, I think, but still.
Okay, well, I'll do what anybody would do who doesn't know how to answer it immediately, and that's correct. A couple of very small things. One is that the left is not militant here. Okay, I think it's important just to remember it's not against you, but just, this is not a militant left in the sense that we sometimes think of, radicals with, violent means. It's just not. The left in Israel stands not only for opposing occupation, but also for more democratic Israel based on, channeling political aims into institutions. That's why they have been so mobilized around the struggle to preserve democratic institutions and practice in Israel, including struggling against occupation. The other sort of tweak I would make to your question is that the people in Israel who were deeply, deeply, opposed and heavily mobilized against Netanyahu and his government's plans to undermine the judiciary, and by extension pass numerous laws that would also undermine democracy in Israel, went far beyond the left. Okay, let's keep in mind, if you do surveys, survey research is very consistent about the number of people who consider themselves to be left-wing in Israel. It doesn't go beyond 18%, roughly. In the Jewish population, which is the highest, first of all, the majority, but also vote at much higher rates. So roughly, they make up about 90% of the people who actually vote. The number of self-identified left is only between 12 and 14%. And yet, what we see on the streets of Israel from January onward, every week, and many cases more than once a week, is a vast mobilization of people, not only from the mainstream left, but also the center, which is about a quarter of Israeli society, and significant portions of the ideological right wing, not necessarily people who voted for the coalition, although some of them also have buyer's remorse. The point is this, the struggle that was going on in Israel before this to oppose the policies of the current government was very much a multicolored political struggles that stretched, let's say, from what we call the moderate right. It could be a little more complicated than that if we had time, but what we call the moderate right, or even, this may sound strange, but the liberal right, because there is historically a nationalist right wing in Israel that is fairly secular and believes in the separation of religion, state, and a certain commitment. At least they don't see a contradiction between being nationalist, expansionist, and committed to liberal democratic institutions. That's the historic roots of the Likud party. Most of them have since fled the Likud party under Netanyahu, but that does represent a sort of constituency in Israel, and it's been everyone from them to the center, to the Jewish and Zionist left, to the further left, to Palestinian citizens of Israel, Arab citizens of Israel, who are not always on the street, but certainly were supportive of democracy and oppose the government's plans, because naturally, it should be intuitive about why. They were, they have never been treated as democratic equals, but they still reflect a measure of hope that the state can, sufficiently progress to a place where it would treat them as equal citizens. So that's the nature of that struggle. And I just wanted to point that out because, it is important to think about who is included here. And I would say, again, going back one day before October 7th, what we've seen all year is that the people who believe it is intuitive and, certain, just obvious that you cannot actually maintain a liberal democratic political culture or values and implement an ongoing occupation that is military and authoritarian by its nature, that is also effectively permanent from 1967. That is a much smaller subsection of the protest, but what they've been asking themselves for the entire year, and I shouldn't say themselves because I proudly consider myself one of them, is how to make it clear to the rest of Israelis who are mobilized for democracy that it's not compatible with occupation. Now, after October 7th, it's an entirely different world because in many ways, as we all know, during wartime, democratic norms are suspended. we have a state of emergency, and we always have a state of emergency since 1948, but we've already announced that we're going to be implementing emergency laws. And those are the kinds of things where, these are the moments when Israelis say absolutely security trumps everything, anything related to democratic norms. And so I'm not, and this could go in different ways. On the one hand, because we have this new unity government. Again, it's Netanyahu government presently with Benny Gantz and his party. They're probably effectively, the judicial reform seems to be on hold at least until the end of the war, and then we'll see what happens. But that seems to be a long time away. So maybe it's in a way preserving the status quo, at least in terms of Israel's constitutional order, which was always very tenuous, since Israel neither has a constitution nor even a clear definition of its basic laws. But afterwards, so on the one hand, we've suspended the legislation that would disrupt that order and undermine democratic institutions. And on the other hand, we're at war, which means we're likely to be violating many democratic principles for the sake of the war. And it's, in a way, I think, at least for now, it's the last thing on Israelis' minds. Although, one more note before I pass it back, that the people who were at the forefront of the democracy protest, the leaders, the communicators, the people who've just rallied and mobilized into really a pretty impressive network of citizen groups, very organic and citizen driven, have very immediately, almost instantly transformed themselves into a sort of patriotic relief effort for both soldiers and civilians. We have to remember that most of Israeli civilians are being now displaced from the south and also from the north, and there are enormous just volunteer efforts underway, largely driven by this organic social protest, democracy protest that emerged over the course of the year. But they are still trying to convey, and I think very naturally and rather effectively, that this government was the failure, that it was this government's single-minded focus on destroying the democratic institutions that led it to neglect other policies and brought us to this stage. And I would say it's almost impossible to toe that kind of line at a crisis moment. But I think surprisingly, it's sort of being accepted. There are many families who have family members who are kidnapped in Gaza right now, civilians, who are furious at the government, and it's sort of funneling or channeling the anger at the government over what it was before then, with the anger at the government over what is vastly seen as a debacle, including by people who voted for this coalition. We see survey research making that very clear. And so that is also something that's in the mix for the future. I think I strayed from your question, but I hope it's helpful.
No, it's actually important and very informative, and thank you for giving us this also perspective on the political movement, the way it started and well it might, we still don't know, end up. But let me turn back also to Yazid, because Dalia, before you were touching also on the issue of the regionalization of the conflict. I know that this is not something that is easy to predict, Yazid, but if you would have some word about this, because Dalia, she was saying that there might be also not only problem with actors that Israel is at war, but also with actors of the region that Israel is at peace. How do you see this regional landscape changing in your view?
I was struck by Dalia's comment and thought it was very insightful. And I agree with the thrust of it. If I'm going to add anything to that, the first is and I see a couple of questions already from your audience. I was peeking, so I'll tackle one of them at least in the process. I don't think other actors here, I'm thinking Hezbollah and Iran in particular, want a war at this time, and I don't think Israel wants a war with them. And if fighting does break out, it'll be either because Iran pushes for it or because Israel decides to push for it. I don't think it's because Hezbollah will start it deliberately. But I think what's more important is we're still thinking about this and about regional impacts and responses in the here and now. What happens next in Gaza is going to go on for weeks at least, and possibly months. I think Dalia made some very perceptive comments right at the start about the lack of any Israeli strategic thinking, or if you like, political thinking, that its military operations are geared towards. And the dilemma is clear that the Israeli government, this government, previous governments, just don't have a plan for Gaza. And clearly, what Hamas has succeeded in doing is demonstrating that Israel can no longer have no plan for Gaza, as it were, no policy for Gaza. But clearly, Israel is not going to hand Gaza back to Hamas to the extent that it's in Israel's power to determine that. But neither can it go on controlling Gaza de facto from across the borders, controlling the entry of food, water, medication, not just now, but as I'm sure a lot of your audience are aware, Israeli control never ended, even after military forces and settlers were evacuated in 2005. So Israel is up against this dilemma. And I think this is going to have a major impact on the form and pace and extent of military operations, because in a way, military action is standing in for political action. In the absence of political action, there's bombing and bombing and bombing. Not all this, I think, is preparatory for ground action. It's partly because the Israeli command doesn't actually have a real plan. And in a way, it needs to sort of absorb domestic feelings, show that it's doing something. And therefore, there has to be a lot of sound and fury, the thunder of the guns and the bombs. Ultimately, there will be ground action, but whether Israeli forces enter, the middle of Gaza or all of North Gaza, or start with the north and then go south, whatever they do, the day is going to come when Israel wants to announce, victory or an end to combat operations. And at that point, they will still have no idea of where 2.25 million Palestinians will go. They're certainly not all going into Sinai. Egypt is not going to allow that. It's fanciful to think that even if, currently the discussion is whether Western creditors could forgive Egyptian debt, which is pretty massive right now, and that in return, Egypt would allow the Palestinians into Sinai. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Egyptians will actually accept, and it won't be anything like that. So, all of which is a long way of going back to saying that for the region, I think the real issues, the tensions, the dynamics, the responses will appear, say, in a month's time, not right now. We should be asking the question of, after 2 months of this, where will the region be? Maybe Iranian calculations or Israeli calculations about opening up a second front will shift, in 2 weeks' time or in 4 weeks' time in ways that we can't predict right now.
Yeah, we have a siren. I have to go into another spot.
Okay. So, Maria, I guess.
Yes, please.
I'll continue.
Yeah, please go ahead. Finish your.
Italian stay safe and be able to rejoin us. So my thinking is that we have to be a little bit long term here, and in the longer term, at least in the medium term, let's say, it's clear that Egypt is crucial to anything that happens next, because it's the other country that borders Gaza. Given how much effort and how much political capital the Biden administration has been investing in normalizing ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel, I wouldn't be surprised if eventually, we might not be able to see this now, and it's no use speculating, but eventually, if something is put together, if negotiations take place, whether they involve Hamas directly or indirectly via Qatar or others, I think that we'll end up with some sort of prisoner exchange deal. I mean, that remains a very likely outcome, or part of the likely outcome. But I think that to address the core dilemma of, so what in the longer term happens with Gaza, I don't see how there can be any answer to that without Arab states becoming part of that answer. Now, in the first few hours after I heard the news on 7 October, before we knew about the deaths of civilians on this scale, as I sort of put on my analyst hat and thought forwards, I couldn't see any way out of this dilemma that Israel faces, where it doesn't want to cede victory to Hamas. It doesn't want to allow Hamas to become a sovereign, independent power in Gaza with no Israeli control, no leverage. And I could only see that happening, regardless of what I thought of it, if there was some kind of Arab mandate over Gaza, which would allow Israel finally to let go of its controls and in which Arab governments took responsibility. Now, I'm not saying that's desirable, I'm not saying it's feasible, but clearly we're seeing some of that talk appear here and there at fairly significant levels. And I'm simply pointing out from an objective perspective that the long-term answer, even if it's Palestinian independence, I mean, I don't think Israel is ready for it to discuss that right now, but I just don't see anything that allows autonomy, meaningful autonomy for people in Gaza without new kinds of security guarantees for Israel. And, I don't see all that happening. Personally, I think none of this is going to take place. I don't think a meaningful solution is going to happen, also because, with the focus on Gaza, we're forgetting that the West Bank and East Jerusalem remain directly under Israeli occupation, that in the time that thousands of Israelis and Palestinians have died in and around Gaza, over 50 Palestinians have been killed by soldiers and by Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This is going to intensify. So it's not just about resolving, the situation of Gaza. Israel's dilemma is not only Gaza. The world community's dilemma is not only Gaza. And so once we bring all that back into the picture, I think that, I just don't see an outcome here, sadly. I mean, so, we might hope that something could happen for Gaza that makes a meaningful difference to the lives of the 2.25 million Palestinians in Gaza. But at very best, that still leaves the West Bank and East Jerusalem facing an increasingly vicious, fascistic kind of vigilante settler violence that is aided and abetted by government ministers in Israel. And that, I think, may come back to setting the tone of government policy and politics and discourse in Israel yet again, once this particular battle is over. I'm glad we see Dalia back with us, and hopefully she can take over.
Yes.
Sorry, I could actually hear you just around in the safer part, but I was only partly concentrating because the siren was very long, so I was waiting for it to be over.
Dalia, if you we are glad you are back and you are safe. And if you have any reaction to this, and I will add also to that a question that pop up in the question answer about this. So we said that there is, and you said it, and Yazid said it, that there is no actual clear military plan for the time being, just tactical maybe ideas. And but despite that, the West, both the United States and Europe, seems to have moved very much into just supporting Israel retaliation, almost at least without any condition. How is this like something that, do you have any comment about this? Is this like putting fuel on fire rather than helping a regional response that Yazid was actually trying to put forward?
I understand that there is, very strong support for Israel's military position right now. And I wouldn't say that Israel has no military aims. It does have military aims, but they're tactical. They may be extremely disruptive. I mean, I think the most extreme understanding of Israel's plans is to, penetrate Gaza as, deeper than we have since 1994. I mean, really go into Gaza City and cut the strip into various portions with IDF presence. And that's going to be much more invasive than at any time since, in the last 30 years. What I'm saying is that there's not really a political aim yet. And so in terms of, global support, I mean, that's very, I don't want to, I think that the international community should know very well from decades of experience that having no political plan for the day after in conflict zones will lead to enormous destabilization in the future. And that's why I'm looking very closely to see any indications of scenarios for what might happen in the future. And all I can see in the Israeli conversation, whether it's from officials or from the public or, again, as a public opinion researcher, I look at what kinds of things pollsters are asking in survey research, which indicates something with, what they think the public is hearing. And the kinds of things people are talking about is either the IDF goes completely in, takes over, reoccupies Gaza Strip, and sets up a military government again, like we had up until the agreements, up until 1994. And nobody really wants that. I mean, Israeli people don't want it, the government doesn't want it, I mean, I guess there's some religious, real far right fanatic, sort of religious fanatics who say every inch of land is part of our biblical heritage, but for the most part, even religious nationalists don't really want to, govern 2 million people. And I can't even, in good conscience talk about a scenario where Israel drives out, even half of that number. I mean, it's unconscionable at this stage in history. So the other option is that people talk about bringing in, that the PA would somehow come back, that Fatah would come back and govern through the PA, which I think is equally madness, because anybody who's following dynamics within Palestinian society knows how deeply Palestinians resent the PA and Fatah. And there is, unless the IDF goes and destroys every faction in Gaza, not just Hamas, but all other factions, all other armed factions, which, really would mean killing so many, there's such a vast amount of people that it's almost, I think it's impossible and sort of inconceivable. There is no way, I don't see any scenario in which Fatah or the PA is able to govern in Gaza, for more than a day, if not hours, without total rebellion. Now, the third option is that, Israel, dismantles Hamas's infrastructure and says, well, we just leave it at that. Let the Palestinian people in Gaza decide. But that is a formula for mayhem because of all these competing factions. And I think the only thing that I've been thinking about, and this is, I know we're almost close to the end, but I would be curious to hear how this audience in particular responds to this, is more significant international involvement, not only as peacekeepers. And again, this is my personal idea, I'm floating it here. I don't think too many others have thought about this, but not only in terms of a military or peacekeeping presence, but in terms of much more active support for institution building. And I have been thinking about how this might, work would be overstating the case, but whether it might be a better approach to either of the ones I just said, which seem to me formulas for disaster, each one of them.
Thank you, Dalia. Yazid, if you want to respond to this, but also I would like you to focus especially on the part of the European position insofar and how to, yes, so I want you to really delve into that. Because
sorry, can I say one more thing before you?
Please.
I think I didn't make it clear enough that for all the support of the international community for Israel's military response right now, I mean, as an Israeli and as a person and as an analyst, I think we should all be recommitting to the international law and wars of law. And, we have to say that because anybody who justifies the attack on Hamas is throwing the international system out the window in international law. And if we who say we're committed to international law and the laws of war and treatment of civilians in wartime, allow this and justify it, we might as well say goodbye to that entire international system, which has been under such stress and erosion lately. So sorry, I didn't mean to interject, but I do think it's worth saying.
Please. Yazid.
I agree totally with Dalia, both on the last point in particular, but also on a preceding point about the scenarios that see the Palestinian Authority or Fatah taking over Gaza, etc. None of these are workable, feasible, or frankly desirable given their own trajectory. But I think what I see most of all, and the sort of the parting thought I'd like to leave you and your audience with, is that the impossibility of thinking even of any hypothetical outcome for Gaza that looks at Gaza alone underlines very powerfully that unless the so-called international community realize and come to the conclusion that the only way of ending this kind of bloodshed in future is to take up once more resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in its entirety, and addressing the question of Palestinian rights, individual and national, and the right to self-determination, the right to sovereignty and independence, that unless the international community is willing to take that up again, then it doesn't have any kind of answer, one that brings all those involved most directly and all those beyond them in the region and elsewhere into a framework that is acceptable. Now, that's a tall order, and this is why I don't see it coming, because after all, this same international community, and by this I particularly mean the United States and the European Union, have abdicated this role for nearly a quarter of a century now, for certainly the last 2 decades. And this touches on your question, Maria, finally, about the European Union. I have been struck dozens of times by the contrast between the position taken by the European Council, I think it was March 1998 in Berlin. The statement issued was endorsement of Palestinian statehood unconditionally, preferably through negotiation with Israel, but not conditional on it or on Israeli approval. That was a commitment of principle by the Europeans that then 2 or 3 years later slid into the so-called quartet peace process or peace plan, I forget even the name of it, in which basically the Palestinians had to show good behavior and this and that and the other. Everything became conditional. And the Europeans took comfort hiding behind the US administration and simply following the lead of whatever the US government of the day wished, whether it was George W. Bush or President Obama or Donald Trump, or of course now Joe Biden. So the Europeans were the first to abdicate from a position that was, unambiguous and unequivocal in saying the only solution here is Palestinian statehood alongside Israel. And if today the European Union and the United States administration can't bring themselves to revive that agenda, then, all they're doing at the very best is upholding this status quo that we've seen can't be upheld. And in that, they become morally and politically and historically complicit.
Thank you, Yazid. And I think that the point of historical complicity of the United States and the European Union, it's a very important line that also Yazid left us with. And I would like really to thank you, Dalia, that despite in this difficult situation, you have made time for us. It's really, really, really an honor and really, really important that you have made time to join us. I would like to thank you, Yazid, who, besides being my former professor, you have really given to us an enormously in-depth analysis. And we really thank you also for the many participants. We have over 120. And I really hope that we will talk again. And please stay tuned also on the future Istituto Affari Internazionali webinar we might organize. Thank you and stay safe. Thank you very much.